It was the Rolling Stones who sang, "You can't always get what you want." I always find that if you are singing those words, you feel happier than when you're saying them. Because really, who is glad that you can't always get what you want? I think this is a good time in the world to ask these questions, for pretty much nobody is getting what they want these days. Even if the pandemic has brought an unexpected blessing or two to your life, overall, it's not something that any of us wanted or want. And day by day, we are still asked to behave in ways we don't want for the health and safety of everyone around us. You can't always get what you want. We know this to be true. Indeed, we learned it from our childhood. What's that saying for children? You get what you get and you don't get upset. Of course, we might say that, but I don't actually think we follow it. When we don't get what we want, we get upset. Turn on the news. I promise you, there is a story there about someone who is upset because they didn't get what they wanted. And yes, sometimes it is important to get upset. When there is injustice, when there is abuse of power, when there is indignity or cruelty, we all need to get upset. Over the past months and in recent days, we've heard disturbing news that should make everyone upset. We need to be upset sometimes in order to make a change. But sometimes we need to check ourselves to see whether our irritation is because of that kind of bigger issue, or whether it's simply because what is happening doesn't match our own expectations or our own desires. Take a look at what's happening in our Bible reading, for example. Jesus is commenting on a pattern he's been noticing that David Lose calls the Goldilocks syndrome, never being quite satisfied. It's too hot or it's too cold. We want the thing that is just right. When it comes to a prophet for God, they complain that John the Baptist was too severe, too serious, too strict with all of his rules, his fasting. But Jesus was too permissive, never stuck to the rules. Where was the prophet who was just right? The one that would be more like them, who'd tell them things that would make them feel good about the things they were already doing, who gave them what they wanted. We hear Jesus' frustration in his words as he says, "Thank God you're a different kind of God, who shows up in the ways that children and infants can understand, but leaves those who think of themselves as wise and intelligent second-guessing." And then he goes on to talk about foreign communities that his followers would assume that God would have no patience or time for. And he turns those expectations on their head too. Are you kidding, he says? In the presence of God, these communities would recognize what they're seeing. You get in your own way with your desires. Today, he might say something like, "Stop being so entitled." It's what gets you in trouble over and over again. As the history of the Christian church and the history of this country makes clear, we make our worst mistakes when we think we alone have all the right answers about who and what is best for others and even for ourselves. And then Jesus says something that seems very strange indeed. "Come to me, all you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens." So far, so good. and I will give you rest. Really good. Take my yoke upon you. Okay, this is where we become frustrated with Jesus, especially if we are feeling weary and carrying heavy burdens. Yes, rest is what we need, but put my yoke upon your shoulders? The last thing we feel like doing in these moments is carrying something else. It's not what we want. We would prefer a God who takes away our problems rather than trying to help us cope with them, who eliminates challenge rather than equipping us for it, who gets rid of our enemy rather than inviting us to make peace with them and maybe even care for them. We want God to take over the filling up of the buckets rather than asking us to keep filling someone else's. Last week I happened upon something quite interesting about the science of happiness from the work of social scientist Dan Gilbert. He argues that while we think getting what we want will make us happy, the truth is getting what we want matters a whole lot less than we think. Gilbert conducted some studies where people were invited to rank a number of items in order of their preference. In one example, they showed people a series of pictures, Monet prints in this case, and invited them to rank them in order of preference, 1 to 6. 1 being your favorite, 6 being the one you don't like so much. And then they were told they could take one of the prints home with them. But the only ones they had available were the ones that the participant has listed as either number 3 or number 4. Well, since both of those options are right in the middle of their selection, they weren't thrilled with the choice, but always chose the one they had identified as number 3 since they liked it slightly better. Well, later in the study, sometimes 15 minutes later and sometimes 15 days later, participants were invited back to rate the same 6 pictures again. And guess what? When asked to re-rank the prints, the one they had previously ranked as number 3, the one they chose and took home, was always at least number 2 in their new ranking. And the one that they had previously ranked as number 4 was lowered to 5th or 6th. It turns out that the experience of that had actually changed their preferences, so that the one that they chose they liked more than they thought. And the one they did not choose, they liked less than before. And Gilbert calls this something like synthesized happiness. It's not fake happiness, but an opportunity to choose to be happy with what you've got. The human psychological immune system has this way of helping people accept the things they cannot change. It is a gift, it turns out, of being human. That when we don't get what we want, we can grow to appreciate what we get. Gilbert did a similar but different sort of experiment with photography students at Harvard. They created a course where the students created 2 photographic works of art. And at the end of the course, they were told that they could take one home, but one needed to be kept as part of the accreditation files or something. And they said to half the participants, don't worry, you can change your mind. A day or a week from now, you can switch it out if you prefer. The other half were told they could make their choice, but they needed to make it, and it was a permanent choice. The other one was going to get locked in a vault or sent across the sea. I don't know, but they could not change their minds. So then later, when participants were brought back and surveyed, the ones who were told that they had the option to change their minds were often not particularly happy with their original choice, even if they hadn't exercised the option to switch it out. They weren't really happy with the picture they took home. It was often in a drawer or put aside somewhere. And guess who was universally satisfied with the one they took home? The ones who had no options to change their minds. They got what they got and then learned to love it. In later versions of the experiment, they told students more about the plan in advance, and so they let them pick whether they wanted to be in the group that could change their minds or the group that had to stick with whatever they chose. And as you can imagine, I think, a large majority of the people wanted to be in the group that was allowed to change their minds later. This is the group that we knew from the previous studies would be unhappy with their final choice. It turns out that getting what we want isn't always the best thing for us. It also turns out that when we don't get what we want, we can still be happy. I'm reminded of Reinhold Niebuhr's famous prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And so I am drawn back into the words of Jesus, where he begins by noticing that the people aren't finding a God to their liking. I'm reminded that we don't always make the best choices for ourselves. What we want isn't always what we need. Tired and weary people, burdened people. Perhaps what we need is not so much a command to take care of ourselves, but rather a reminder that we can choose to be happy where we are. A reminder that we can do this because God shows up to care for us in the places we don't expect or even want God to be. In our neighbor, in the person who doesn't look anything like us, in the person who believes and thinks and acts differently than we do, and just as importantly, than we think they should. Have you noticed how this theme has appeared and reappeared all this month? Maybe that's because we don't find it easy. Because we want what we want, after all. But this God, whom we would rather not want, tells us that we will find our lives when we give them away. That we will find rest if we let someone share the burden we have been carrying and help shoulder a yoke that is not ours. That's the real way real burdens are lightened. It's how buckets get filled. They did not say it first. They did not say it best. But it turns out the Rolling Stones may have got it right. You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you might find you get what you need. Thanks be to God. Amen.